Oh, no.
Well, thank you very much. Let's get things underway. So sustainability, the path to being green in the broadcasting, video streaming and telco industry. To discuss all of that, we have next to me Fabiana Cumia, who's Communications and ESG Director at Rakuten TV Europe. You heard from them as well a little earlier on. Next to her is Will Ennett. Will is Head of Sustainability and ESG for Talk Talk. And Michelle Papagiannakos, who is Group Senior Sustainability Manager at the BBC. Welcome, everybody. Stupid question, what does ESG stand for? I should know.
I hope everybody here knows that it stands for environmental.
I think this is 101 for sustainability for all of us here.
I think that it's important to understand that behind the environment, social governance letter, it stands for impact, which is environmental impact and social impact that companies can produce behind their profit.
Okay. And it's interesting because both you and Will, the position in your company, in Rakuten, is fairly new. You effectively took it on yourself earlier this year. Was it an easy sell to your bosses that they should have a division to look at sustainability?
No. To my boss, yes, because I think the CEO of Rakuten TV has been very clever in understanding the potential behind ESG. But in general terms, I would say that no, it's been a challenge. So the ESG area within Rakuten TV is new. We've been creating this year, the area. And it's complicated because it's a startup. So when something is new, it's difficult for everybody to understand what it means, why it's important, why it's not a plus, but it's a must, and how to integrate it in the company strategy, allocating resources.
And what was your first move when the post was created and you moved into doing that? Was it the education exercise, or was it also, I guess, a look at where the emissions are coming from within the company?
So first of all, I studied. Second, the first move has been making understand to the company management the benefits of ESG, not only in terms of impact, but also in terms of profitability for the company, competitive advantage. And the very first thing we kicked off the area with has been reporting, understanding where we were in order to understand where we want to go. So we did our first social impact report this year for 2022, and the first carbon footprint organization for scope 1, 2, and 3. We found out which our main sources of emission are, so we know where we want to go and which are the main pillars we want to focus on.
And you said early on in your answer there, you talked about profitability for the company. My experience of doing anything to try and help the environment is that it costs me more. So when you transfer that to an entire company, I'm guessing you've got a bit of a challenge on your hands.
There is a huge challenge because topics about sustainability, they've got a long-term results, and also it's very hard to see the direct correlation with profit. So it's very hard to sell it internally. But in our case, we are a streaming, but also a content production company. So we saw a direct impact on our company strategy because we look at sustainability, both looking at environment, but also social sustainability. And we decided to focus a wide part of our original content production on social impact content, advocating diversity, gender equality, mental health.
So beyond sustainability and into a wider current and beyond social issues.
Exactly. Both sustainability, environmental sustainability, and human sustainability. So in our case, being sustainable not only means reducing emissions and looking after our environmental impact, but also focusing on our social impact. And in the case of a content platform like ours, it's crucial because being social sustainable means broadening our target, and that means profit. So it's for sure a matter of ethics, but also it's a matter of profit, because the more diverse is our content and the more sustainable is our content in representing and respecting society, the more our target will be representative of everybody, so the wider will be our customer base.
Well, let's talk. I think you've also moved from sort of being on TV side of things to dealing with the sustainability issues. And all three of you kind of have the same problem, which is basically no matter how good you are, you can't do anything about the consumer who's watching you on a 10-year-old television set. How do you square that?
Thank you. And I think that's a very good question. There's a body called DIMPACT. We're not members, but I've previously been a member and would wholeheartedly recommend looking at their work. And they've looked at the carbon footprint of video streaming. And you're right in that actually where they've identified the hotspot is not so much the network itself, but very much in the end customers' homes, the devices that they use. For us as a business, our devices, so set-top boxes in homes or routers principally, will be probably about the second largest impact. Now, I
guess there's things you can do to those set-top boxes in the design process, but we all know that companies, not just Talk, all of them, you want to keep the set-top box in the field for as long as possible because updating a set-top box every 2 years is certainly not good for the CFO and it's not good for the environment either.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, when it comes to devices, so I confess I'm not too sure about TV sets, but when it comes to, let's say, if you take the life cycle or the total carbon footprint of a lot of electronic consumer devices, but particularly in our case, routers and set-top boxes, the largest use is actually in the usage phase. So, that rather than, let's say, what's often called the embodied emissions, so the emissions to manufacture, to create the device. We have a tricky balancing act, which is actually the more we can keep it out in field and the fewer that we manufacture from scratch. But on the same time, obviously newer generations, if they lead to a significant reduction in energy usage, that's positive. So the middle ground, if you like, that anyone can do is refurbishment. And that's where we've been particularly successful is kind of doubling our rate of refurbishment. So, just putting a lot of effort and that's really in how you communicate with customers to get devices back. So not particularly kind of exciting, but actually incredibly valuable because that reduces our carbon footprint and obviously.
And I guess it might be as simple as I'm about to say something with Jiffy Bag, but I'm not entirely sure if
Jiffy
Bag is particularly sustainable themselves.
But I think the cost of sending out that plastic Jiffy Bag is outweighed by the benefit.
Yes, of course.
But no, and that to your point earlier with Fabiana, I mean, I actually look at it, and when we've made the business case, that's a critical business case, right? Which is, I won't say how many millions, but many millions saved by refurbishment programs or energy usage in the data centers. So
it's interesting because it seems, and I'm sure bits of Talk and other companies are doing this. If you send out a new router in the post, the idea of using less packaging, well, actually, it's sensible anyway because you're using less packaging. Less packaging surely costs less than using more, but yet it's something you have to have a whole sustainability program to think about. But it is the kind of thing which can, by the time you add up all the savings on each one sent out, it's probably quite a decent contribution.
I think so. I think there's definitely savings there. The packaging itself, again, looking at that whole life cycle of the carbon footprint of a product is relatively low in electronics versus maybe FMCG, where obviously you think,
No, that's true. But it also creates perception on the customer's mind, doesn't it?
It's perception. So, again, some of our latest devices now come with 50% recycled casing or no single-use plastic in the packaging. And actually the challenge there, as you say, is on the surface there's potentially a cost saving, but it's the disruption to process. That's one of the things is how do you actually just change processes so that yourself and your manufacturers and suppliers can do things in a new way. And there may be a small increase in cost. Actually, increasingly, what we're finding is cost neutral. But then there is absolutely that long-term cost saving, aside from all the other, I think, benefits that Fabiana pointed to.
Michelle, I will mention, I think, organisations who you can count what you're doing against. Are there Are there many of them, and who are they, and what do they all count? What do you have to prove to them each year?
I think for kind of our carbon emissions or our net zero targets, there's kind of set organisations out there. So there's kind of greenhouse gas protocol that everybody kind of signs up to, so that when we talk about getting to kind of net zero, everyone's using the same methodology to account against, which is really fundamentally important. And then what we're trying to do at the BBC is roll out kind of and actually along with our kind of supply chain and other kind of broadcast partners, is a kind of like one industry approach. So we're using a mechanism, our pitches are always full of acronyms, but CDP is an organisation which stands for, or used to stand for Climate Disclosure Project, until they just went with the acronym and lost what they stood for. But they're globally accepted, used by hundreds of thousands of organisations to report disclosures on in relation to climate. And so the BBC is an organisation that submits a disclosure, but for this year, we asked 450 of our top suppliers to also disclose, and we were looking around. So because broadcasters is a very unique sector, especially the BBC's supply chain is like, it ranges from Bob's Props all the way to IBM. You know, we've got every supplier kind of going out there. We needed something that was kind of could be universally applied, and we asked our top 450, and we got over 53% responses to that. And so through that, using that as a mechanism, we can look at their maturity, we can get their greenhouse gas emissions and start using that in our own accounting for what we call Scope 3, so that's our supply chain. And we're trying to do something so that our suppliers don't have to do kind of 100 and million one disclosures depending on who's asking. It's that one disclosure that's accepted by everyone.
Because the BBC, as we're regularly reminded in the press, is a vast organisation, but you're dealing with, I guess, the things that, so many companies deal with, simply offices with windows that need to be insulated, all the way through to what, I guess, links the three of you together on the panel, the broadcasting stuff. I'm wondering if the producers are commissioning a new programme, do you do things like writing in various sustainability things into the contract?
We do. So we've got, you can imagine I call them I imagine it as levers. There's kind of multiple levers that you can use depending on what you're buying, essentially. And the way that we procure programmes is we commission them, and everyone's very artistic. So it's even harder when you're got a creative audience to say, right, let's be sustainable, and to you don't want to shoehorn them in. So one of the biggest impact areas in kind of productions and making TV programs is the way that you provide electricity or energy or heat into the site. And so traditionally, a production would be to be like, right, we need a generator, and we need the biggest generator possible to provide that kind of resilience in terms to make sure that the production doesn't, fail if they're shooting something outside, you can imagine, in the middle of nowhere. And actually, one of the things that we've looked at through looking at the data is that they completely overspecify the requirements of the generator. And so therefore, you have a massive generator running using lots of diesel when you actually don't need it to. So all you need to do is be a bit smarter, work out, how many lights and TVs, and actually kind of downsize to what your requirements actually are. But there's a lot of kind of education in order to and kind of putting that risk boundary around it so that people aren't, don't automatically go to their default. And then it's a kind of transition away from, this time instead of using diesel, let's put HVO fuel in it and see how that goes. And then eventually, where we'd like to optimise to be is to kind of have kind of battery or hydrogen we've used on kind of our Winter Watch series. So
it's the natural human thing, I guess, isn't it, to make sure, I've got to make sure I'll go for the next one up just in case. But of course, it comes at a double cost, both in terms of how much money it's costing me, the licence fee payer, but also what it's costing the environment and unnecessary energy that could be spent.
Definitely. And it's, like you said, there's lots of different levers. So that's one kind of lever. We have a target for 100% of our TV productions to be Albert certified, and that therefore kind of drives what we call decarbonisation, because they have to go through a set kind of questionnaire and fill all the information in back in. So there's that element. And then more interestingly, the stuff that we're doing in our kind of what I call business as usual contracts. So, it's just like any other organisation. outsource lots of different things from HR and payroll and things like that. And what we've done there is implement a new mechanism called a decarbonisation level agreement, which is really...
Carbonisation...
Level agreement. So
level
a bit like how
okay.
you go out for a contract and you've got service level agreements in traditional kind of contracting. This is very innovative. That's not really being done by many other organisations. So to take the BBC, which kind of like sits over here, into like the future, using where we've set with multi-million-pound contract, a 2.8% year-on-year reduction in their emissions, and we're just what we're calling in the transition phase now before that contract goes live next year, and working out, okay, what's the baseline, and then how are we going to track that 2.8% reduction year-on-year with kind of penalty clauses within it if they don't meet that target. And that's very unique. That doesn't, those kind of contracts with those sustainability requirements don't really exist elsewhere within the UK or globally yet. So we're kind of using that as our pilot. You know, can we make this contract work? Is it doable? And then if so, we can replicate that across the rest of the
It's interesting because you can change your own behaviour. Well, in theory, you can change your own behaviour relatively easily. But Will, I'd imagine that changing the behaviour of the suppliers, even with such contracts, is a little bit challenging. And I wonder how you would organise that within Talk and getting everybody, basically everybody in the chain on board with the programme, as it were.
Yeah, and I think the first thing is that the same way, you know, Michelle and Fabiana, all of us will be looking at suppliers, is because for, you know, telecom media tech companies, it will always be the largest source of emissions in that standardized reporting framework. So in our business, about 80%. Again, you look at most other telecoms companies in the UK, large multinationals, you know, you're going to vary between 70 and 90%. So it's quite sort of standard. So we have to tackle that. I guess probably taking a slightly different approach, just because when I was looking at all the numbers, what you ended up finding was there was a relatively small number, about 100 or so, who represent quite a significant percentage of our total supply chain spend and emissions. So we've taken a slightly more personalized approach, where just with those account managers, I've just gone out and spoken to every single one of them and just sort of personally guilt-tripped them or whatever into action.
You must meet resistance, you know, I can't do that because if that happens, then this will happen, that will, etc.
Yeah, and I think there's probably going through two phases. So one thing that, again, is fairly, you know, reasonably common for companies to do is what's called a supplier engagement target. So what percentage of your spend is with companies who've set a credible carbon reduction target. So basically, they've publicly said they're going to go from A to B in their emissions. So, for example, TalkTalk as a company have got what's called validated science-based targets. So that's one of the key ones for corporates. And what we're doing is just engaging those and trying to get them through that funnel, right? So they start from zero, and then they go to maybe committing, and then they go through the process of actually having these targets, you know, independently assessed by someone. But then equally, there might be smaller companies we deal with, and there's inexpensive or free versions of that as well. So we don't particularly mandate what it is. I think that's the first step. But then actually, you know, when we've looked at our business, you know, most businesses, you make it very complicated, and there's not really, actually. You know, for us, really, there's two principal things that the customer needs. One is, you know, a broadband network, and there we rely on a lot of suppliers to provide that. And the second thing they need is some form of device in their household, a router or a set-top box, or we don't sell a lot, but a few mobile phones. So they need a device then to use it. And so really, those are the hotspots. You know, as Michelle mentioned, there are lots of other ancillary services that you get. And for those providers, just that basic level of a carbon reduction target is great. But getting into that next level of detail, which we like to do with network and with devices, is right. Well, what is our joint plan together to get? I'm jealous of this sort of. I haven't got something quite as formalised with the with the reduction, so I'll take that back to them. But you know, we've really stressed and just had a lot of conversations with the proper commercial people on both sides on the table, so they understand, you know, actually, and they're bought into that process. Because if it's just
do you find is, for example, a smaller company more likely to be willing to take things on board than a larger company, or is it down to the person? Hence your little scheme of getting them on board.
I mean, I think it is obviously on an individual basis, and not to characterise any particular size, but obviously there is a resource question. Right? So larger corporates have resources, and so have people like us on the panel, and smaller companies don't always have that. So it can really vary. But equally, I was just talking to a company recently, and they would just love to act. And so equally, the flip side is that once they're convinced, a small company can move much quicker to actually make the commitments and start to move, rather than waiting for a board meeting in 6 months' time to ratify something. So,
what if we could look maybe now in a little bit more detail at some of the regulations and the industry standards which are around, which affect, I guess, the practices within all of your organisations. Fabiano, as I understand it, there's still no compulsory standards that people have to adhere to. I don't know, how do we convince the outside world that some sort of good is being done and there's a reason for taking the actions that we're doing beyond, obviously, what we see in the environment around us?
I think it's exactly what Will was saying before. If you don't have compulsory standards, even though the European sustainability reporting standards and the CSDR directives, I mean, there are directives which are making a big push, but still none of these directives are compulsory for companies under a certain threshold. And that means that all of us are not going at the same speed. We are not all of the same, on the same page. And this means that, for example, it's harder for small companies to either adopt those standards because they're expensive or because they're not compulsory. Or, for example, they've got 2 years of flexibility more than others, the big companies, to adopt those standards.
And flexibility can sometimes mean don't do anything, can't it? For some organisations, they'll say, let's move this a couple of years away. We don't have to worry about it until a couple of years away.
Exactly. And as we were saying before, until it's not a matter of business, of profitability, not all companies can afford to spend money in sustainability because they don't see immediate results. So, for example, talking about sustainable productions, in our case, we know that there is a certain amount of money that you have to put increasing the movie budget, the P&L budget, to make it sustainable, because you need to follow a protocol, you need a certification, you need to switch from non-sustainable to sustainable alternatives. And this means that either you have that budget or you have a regulation pushing you to adopt those measures. The third factor, which could be attraction in absence of the first two, could be the pressure from consumers. So data shows how consumers are willing to consume more sustainable products, how sustainable products grow faster than non-sustainable products.
Do you think consumers will make a choice on companies based on sustainability, or is it the sort of thing that they say when they're asked for a survey, but when it comes down to it, they basically go with whatever provides them with the best value?
So that's interesting, because I think all of us have been growing up in the last years reading those surveys assessing that 2/3 of global consumers are willing to spend more for sustainable products. As a consequence, for example, products making ESG claims are growing faster than the country. For example, they are growing 28% more respect non-ESG compliant products. So all of this is absolutely true. But what has been surprising for me is that I've been reading last survey by Foresight Factory Studio saying that in the last years, 2 over 5 consumers are more willing to prioritize economic growth rather than environmental protection. And part of that is given by climate fatalism. So that's also about the storytelling the correct storytelling we are doing about sustainability. If we pass the message that it's too late, or it's not important, or it's too late and there's nothing left to do, people will end up thinking that they don't have to commit. So again, as big companies are pushed to adopt ESG strategies and attitudes, if they have money or if they have regulations, in absence of all of this, the consumer's push is a big traction factor I think that's very discouraging data of this last survey that I'm mentioning.
Okay.
I don't think it's just consumers though. ESG is really good for employers as well. A lot of our modelling that we've done around the kind of corporate frameworks that you mentioned, so another acronym is TCFD, so that's about doing risk assessment and looking at your opportunities around kind of climate change and putting a financial figure on that. And the figures that when we're doing it within the BBC is actually we look at the opportunity that is being a green company, and that especially around like kind of the younger generations coming into the workforce. They don't want to work for companies with poor reputations in this arena. And in fact, like I think the last stat that I looked at, 70% of under 25s wouldn't work for an employer that they didn't have kind of that kind of belief in. So it doesn't just work on the consumer, it also works kind of internally with the kind of HR policies as well to kind of tie in ESG quite broadly across all our kind of chains within an organisation.
And we have something, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah,
it's,
TCFD.
TCFD, if anybody's taking note of all the acronyms. But our organisations, is that organisation and others like it to the benefit of the BBC and other organisations?
The BBC do it, and actually just released in the last month was one around nature as well. So organisations are kind of only just grappling with climate change, and now we have an even broader one on nature and actually how looking at the impact that we are having on nature and vice versa, and how reliant and codependent we are on one another. And it's kind of nature and climate change have obviously very much kind of overlapped and crossover. One impacts the other, and also our resilience to kind of get out of climate change very much might revolve around kind of nature-based solutions, whether it's kind of reforestation and planting more forests. So these frameworks are really, really useful because they provide a common platform for all organisations to use. They've initially been set up for big insurance or banks, that kind of financial services sector. But we find that we can use them within the BBC to great effect in order to kind of communicate with our board about what we're doing. And kind of within the financial services sector, they're used by investors to decide whether to invest or not in a company. So they're kind of fundamental as well.
Well, do you think this sort of change comes through regulations and those us being separate a little bit from Europe compared to how we used to be? Are there better regulations to be had elsewhere?
I mean, I think regulation's important, but I think for this sector, it's not in and of itself like a highly polluting sector where there is going to be, for example, heavy carbon taxation in the next couple of years. That's very unlikely. So the reality is that the movement to be more sustainable as a company is probably going to come from other stakeholders, and we talked about a few of them just now, like investors. 90%, I think, of the world's GDP is tied up with investors who have set net zero targets. So if they're serious about it, they will start really coming in. It's their responsibility to look at their portfolio of investments and understand the trajectory. So we certainly see that with investors. I think another key category is actually B2B customers, because as I mentioned before, so Michelle and myself are going to our suppliers demanding action, but I get on a weekly basis surveys upon surveys because we sell broadband into businesses of all types.
Really on both ends of it, really.
So I get both ends of it.
You're pressurising your suppliers, and it's actually happening the other way around too.
And so I'm sure there's many in this room who as well are B2B suppliers into broadcasters, streamers, whoever. And so for them, actually, there's probably an even more direct business case, because if not today, at some point, those companies will come to you, ask for various disclosures, information, understand what you're doing, because it is part of their numbers, so they're very directly correlated.
Well, have you got some sort of real-world examples of how we can sort of fix things at all? Fabiana, I guess for you, it's data centres, is it not, which would be the greatest source of emissions, and that sounds like a pretty big one to solve, really.
Yeah, indeed, we found out from our first carbon footprint calculation that data centers are the main source of emission of our company. That's not surprising. You were mentioning the impact study, and last year they say that data centers and CDNs are globally making the 2-3% of electricity consumption at a global level. So not surprising for us. So that has been the first, let's say, focus area of our company. And actually, we managed to significantly reduce our carbon emissions, electricity consumption, by adopting specific measures in operation. First of all, in the second half of this year, we reduced the data storage of our data centers with a technology which is basically deprecating all legacy DRM. And our data centers are cloud-based since ever. And also the fact that we are able to track and report our emissions is a very good way to start because, again, we know where we are, so we are able to disclose and set goals. And the second thing we did at the technological level has been adopting a measure in our encoding technology. It's called per title encoding technology since the last 2 years or so, where we basically adapt the encoding per each title, thus reducing traffic, electricity, and emissions. So for us, there has been a way to significantly reduce our emissions.
And helped by technology advances, it sounds like as well. I'm wondering if you need an engineer to help me with this, but perhaps if you move things to the cloud, does that transfer the problem, or does it also reduce emissions at the same time in the round? Because you're moving something to the cloud, maybe Amazon or somebody else is operating that, and you no longer are, but there's still emissions coming from the cloud, but presumably not as many? Is that how it works?
Absolutely. We didn't have the need to transfer because our services have been always cloud-based. But yes, absolutely. I mean, there are emissions coming from the energy consumption of data centers, but definitely less. So yeah.
And this is the problem we have. We don't have emissions. None of us have a business, which is it's getting them as low as.
The main source of emissions in the broadcasting industry.
It's all closed down or go back for a couple of channels. I think one of the things that the BBC has been doing, you've got good old David Attenborough to kind of help and guide us through. And I was interested that his most recent series was sort of pushed back earlier into the schedule than it might into more Sunday tea time than Sunday evening, because I think there was this desire that the message could better reach a different and perhaps younger audience by doing so.
Yeah, the BBC's got a huge audience research arm where we're trying to always make content that audiences want to watch, and also that is shown or watched at a time. But I think we are, in our kind of business model, looking at, people are moving away, like the potential of people that watch stuff on iPlayer compared to kind of terrestrial, like, timetabled programs. It's forever just increasing just onto the iPlayer where people watch on demand, which is what everybody knows anyway. And so even putting something earlier on in the schedule, it changes things, but not dramatically. But we do have a massive kind of legacy and reputational risk attached to our kind of natural history program, in that we put David Attenborough out there, but if people look under the covers, the BBC they've got to be as good as David Attenborough, in terms of what we're doing, and so we use that as to good effect internally to be able to say, come on, this is what everybody out there expects, not least the Daily Mail. But
so I remember being told by somebody who's working for Discovery Channel in Denmark, who used to run some of the David Attenborough series. The first step was to dub the show so that everybody could understand what was going on. But they realised they were better off subtitling, because Sir David's voice was so instantly recognisable that people didn't believe that it was a BBC David Attenborough documentary unless it had his voice attached to it.
We actually have an AI David Attenborough voice. It's very speakably very believable.
Given that Sir David is 97, it's possibly just as well.
But we are doing a lot of things as well in terms of kind of our streaming and what we're doing. So we realise, again, looking at kind of audience data and how people kind of consume BBC products. A lot of people put the TV on to listen to the radio.
There was this survey not long ago, and it was like, why are all these US comedies topping the list of the favourite comedies? answer because people are putting them on for background from streaming services.
Yeah. So one of the things that we just did in the background was change all the graphics. That's the back page for our radio shows, and that reduced the energy consumption by those devices by 70 to 90%, just by making everything kind of black and making sure it is like as low energy graphics as possible, just on those radio things, because we realised people just switch the telly on and then never look at it. So.
If you go back to Hessian or having like books and live and things behind the newsreaders, might be a bit more cost effective.
Well, that was one of the things that we tried to maintain after COVID and still do, is, we managed to film the whole of the Tokyo Olympics from Salford, and we didn't need to send any reporters there, nobody was there physically, and saying, look, if we were able to do that once, we should be able to do that, keep that kind of digital virtual productions and use it where we can.
This is such a wide topic, and unfortunately we are beyond time, but I hope that next time we have one of these events, be it in London or be it somewhere else, that we'll be able to revisit the topic of sustainability. But thank you all very much for participating. We have a short coffee break, and we've got a couple more sessions to bring you after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.